I'm honored to have been asked to speak to you all tonight. Many of us have met before. My name, again, is Jonathan Tschiggfrie, and I'm both a steamboat enthusiast and a steam calliope devotee, and those interests have led to an avocation in historical research. I'm from the river town of Dubuque on the upper Mississippi, so if you see a Subaru out in the parking lot with Iowa plates that say UMR 579 and a frame that reads Steam Calliopeist, now you'll know why. Also, with apologies to the Calliope people out there, I am going to consistently use the Calliope pronunciation tonight. So, we got Calliope fans here. That's what I grew up calling it. And it's hard to change your ways. So last year during the S&D meet and greet, our illustrious president took me aside and said, "You're our speaker next year, you know." I considered that for a beat and replied, "Sounds good. And what is it I will be speaking on?" Well, that was for me to decide, it turns out. So I thought about it. We've had just a fascinating few years of speakers from some of the fresher faces among our ranks. Philip Johnson in 2019 spoke on the preservation efforts surrounding the Delta Queen. Then Taylor shared the podium with Gary Frommel to talk about the J.A. Crusoe and the history of boat building in Clarington. 2 years ago, we had Ciara up here discussing the family business and recent acquisition of the Joe S. And of course, last year's presentation by Matt Dow, A Tale of Two Sternwheelers, covering the journey of the city of New Orleans and the return of the Natchez. So, with Jeff continuing on his kick to get us youngins up here speaking in front of everyone, and with all these wonderful first-hand stories the last few years, I can't help thinking there's been some kind of mistake. Here's my CV in short. I've really got no experience working on the river. Dad spent 13 or so summers on the DQ as a deckhand, watchman, sign painter, calliope player. That's how all this got started, clearly. And certainly I count myself fortunate to possess cherished friendships with those who have built careers working on boats and in an otherwise more professional capacity. But my working life has been entirely in music, education, and in software development. I'm just another steamboat fanatic. Nobody consequential, really, in the story of our rivers. So I sat at my desk to write this talk, and I wondered, what could I possibly have to share with a group that's already so knowledgeable? Well, I haven't really found an answer to that question yet, but seeing as I'm up here, I need to say something. So I thought I would describe my experiences as an amateur historian, and maybe some of it will even resonate with a few of you as well, particularly, perhaps, the exquisite frustration that comes with the territory. So in the first part of my talk, I'm going to go over the methods and tools I've used in my activities researching river history and the Calliope. So let's start there. I began to take my research seriously back in 2005, right around the time I was getting ready to head off to college. Things got interesting right from the get-go. You quickly learn that confirming details and nailing down stories is a tricky thing. There are multiple versions of the facts, and you have to do your best to try to reconcile them with each other. Preparing for this evening's talk, I figured that concept would be a good title for this first part. So, like Pilate nearly 2,000 years ago, I often find myself asking, what is truth? It's not a simple question. On the surface, it seems like it, but it's not. The truth is really what you're trying to determine as a historian so that you can tell that higher level story. I firmly believe that the details do matter, so what you spend your time doing is tracking down the sources and comparing the claims. It's especially fun when you come up with an answer that flies in the face of conventional wisdom, which I can tell you has happened multiple times in the course of my inquiry around Calliopes. Anyhow, it was becoming clear that retelling river stories was going to be a challenge in terms of verification, and the Calliope being larger than life itself, even more so. particularly if I wanted to someday provide the definitive, duly researched story of the Calliope on American rivers. It was going to be an exercise as much in setting the record straight as it would be preservation. This was going to be a lot of work, and I didn't really yet know how incredibly frustrating it was going to be at times. Still, something, I don't really know what, but something in my brain or in my soul, I guess, I was going to be the guy to literally write the book on Calliopes. Quite an undertaking. Surely nobody had attempted to do this before. Oops, I got the wrong. There it is. So let's talk about these two little volumes that already exist. The one on the left was published in 1986 by a local historian outside Akron, Ohio. The author attempts to cover the entire history of the instrument from its initial conception in the 1850s onto its adoption on steamboats, in the circus, and in parades. However, many of the facts that he presents in the book's 70 pages take very little effort to refute, so much that it's really kind of an embarrassment. It's unfortunate that this is the primary publication currently available to the general public on the subject. Now, Les Swanson's Steamboat Calliopes, on the other hand, that's a whole other matter. Writing primarily from his experience as a musician aboard the steamer Washington in the late 20s, it includes a really fascinating firsthand account of the height of the Tschiggfrie era of excursion steamboating, as well as Les's return to steamboats and Calliopes nearly 50 years later. Still, neither one of these books completely, or in the first case accurately, covers the full picture of the instrument in the American cultural consciousness. That problem, it was clear to me, needed a remedy, and I was going to be the one to provide it. Since coming to that conclusion, my research efforts have been mainly directed toward the eventual publication of such a volume. And so it's become a consuming passion. It's taken up more of my free time than I probably care to admit. It's also tedious work, but work that I'm glad to do with an end goal in mind. And it always gives me an interesting answer when people ask, what do you do? Well, I tell them about my day job, of course, but almost without fail, the conversation turns to, and in my spare time, I research steam Calliopes. It's at this point that the chat typically comes to a sudden halt, and I get to watch the other person's face as their brain tries to process what they just heard. Honestly, more often than not, I end up having to explain what a calliope even is. And if I can see that they'd rather just move on with our small talk, I'll say, oh, it's like a pipe organ, but smaller, and it runs on steam instead of air. And then we leave it at that as we shift our confabulatory attention to the local weather conditions. So how does one go about studying the calliope or the steamboat? Well, for the latter, there's already an overwhelming amount of literature available, which I'm sure you all know. There are a number of good primers on the subject, and also plenty of books and periodicals with a narrower focus that provide worthwhile insight. And chief among these books, well, the good book, of course, or I should say books. Now, Captain Way's Directories really are the reference material for anyone with even a casual interest in steamboat history. Honestly, I really don't know how you could do it without them. They're worth every penny and then some. I've spent so much time, and I'm sure this is familiar to a number of you as well, just scribbling notes in the margins of these books and flipping back and forth through their pages. Eventually, I had to rip the spines off of them, hole punch all 900 plus pages, and put them in a 3-inch thick binder. I'd also bet I'm not the only one in this room that's had to buy replacement copies. So we'll get back to talking about the directories in the second part of this talk, but suffice it to say for now, they're truly what make this kind of research even possible. Imagine trying to do family genealogy without, for example, census records. That's the level of importance that we're talking about here. Even so, the directories are not without mistakes. Whether they're transcription errors or perhaps problems with the source material, I found a fair number of corrections to be made, which likewise we'll come back to that in a bit. With works of this magnitude, though, that kind of thing is bound to happen. Nobody could be faulted for that. But what do you do then as a researcher when you find a mistake in your primary reference? Well, I would learn before long that nothing beats primary sources, and any researcher worth their salt will tell you the same. There's no substitute for photographic evidence, for first-person accounts and interviews, for newspapers and journals that are contemporary with the time being studied. Primary sources are your best bet for getting the story right, especially when they're corroborated by at least one other additional independent source. So let's start with photographs, which are perhaps the most reliable form of cold, hard evidence, or at least before artificial intelligence came along. There's a warm wave of satisfaction that comes over you when you can take a photo and positively say, that's the Asa Wilgus, no doubt about it. It's nice to have that kind of certainty to latch onto, especially when it supplies undeniable proof for an historical fact, or better yet, one of your cockamamie theories that now appears to be authoritative. How sweet is the taste of righteous vindication. But it's not always so. Even with the evidence staring at you in literal black and white, you still need to have a certain level of awareness and familiarity with the subject, which for me has come with my frequent perusal of Ways directories. One of the most common things you'll encounter that requires this sort of knowledge is when you're dealing with trying to identify a boat, which is only one of several vessels to have carried that same name. Maybe you can use the date of the photo if you know it, or the fact that the boat in the photo is a stern wheeler instead of a side wheeler, or maybe there's some idiosyncrasy about a particular boat's construction or equipment or trimmings that make the identification simple. If you don't have that info, but there are other boats visible in the photo, you can maybe narrow down the year that the photo was taken by cross-referencing when those other vessels operated, thanks to the directories. Or maybe there's something about the background in the photo that makes a location identifiable, which helps you to narrow things down. But it's not always that simple. Sometimes you just have to write down a way number and put a question mark next to it. Maybe it's that boat, maybe not. In decades past, even if you knew about photographs of boats existing somewhere, there was still the problem of access. And that's going to be one of the main themes of this talk. Today, the great news is that there are many collections of steamboat and river photographs available online for free to the general public. Among those that I reference most regularly and are frequently used for the Reflector as well, come from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse's historic steamboat photograph collection, which was largely the work of Ralph Dupay initially, and the Murphy Library staff at UW-La Crosse working with support from the J. Mack Gamble Fund. Then there's the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library's Inland Rivers Photograph Collection, which is chiefly Fred Way's photo collection, which I don't remember who was telling me, but I understand that's recently been expanded or is in the process of being expanded. Yes. And also, of course, the University of Louisville Howard Steamboat Museum collection, with credit to Captain Jim Howard and to Jim Rising. And there's also other smaller collections at various universities and historical organizations. These are all an incredible boon to researchers and to anyone with an interest in steamboat history. Like I said, here's where we find the first instance of this recurring theme, this complete paradigm shift in access to research materials compared to only a generation ago. Digitization and increasingly widespread internet connectivity have utterly transformed the ability of amateur and professional researchers alike to more quickly than ever attain the sources they need to further their efforts. I don't think I'd be speaking here tonight without the benefit of such a great convenience, putting those information and even artifacts right at your fingertips at a moment's notice. In the same way, improved access to records for genealogical research has made a significant difference in expeditiousness. The big name here, naturally, is Ancestry.com. I'm sure some of you have used this before. And now we're starting to get into the types of online resources that require a paid subscription. For usually a monthly or an annual fee, you have access to census records, marriage records, death records, immigration passenger lists, which is really cool, city directories, military records, all kinds of stuff. And while this is absolutely vital to have access to, the great genius of a website like Ancestry is that you can also explore family trees that other users of the website have created. There's often many inaccuracies in those because they're just crowdsourced, but it's a great shortcut to finding the relevant people and the family connections that you need in this kind of research. I should also mention there are other genealogy websites out there in addition to Ancestry.com, and also a handy tool called Find a Grave. But Ancestry is really, for me anyway, the bread and butter for tracking down individuals. Genealogy sites also give you a boost when you're researching a particularly important individual and you want to find out if there are any living descendants. In the case of Ancestry.com, if the individual is still living, or if their descendant is still living, it won't give you their name, it will simply confirm that the descendant exists. With that knowledge, there are tricks for genealogical sleuthing to find those living relatives, including, it must be said, a bit more snooping on Facebook and people search type websites than I'm really comfortable with, but I do it anyway, because you can't argue with the results. Doing this sort of PI work is how I found the closest living descendant of Thomas J. Nicol, who was the foremost calliope manufacturer at the turn of the 20th century. And here you can see a few of the photos that I was able to get from that descendant of Thomas and his children. So thanks to this publicly available information, if you know where to look for it, you can end up with info and even photos you weren't ever expecting to uncover. What a joy when it works out. I might also mention that although we live in a digital age, not everything is available online. In some cases, your best option is to contact a librarian or an archivist at a university or a public library or a city or county historical society or a museum. Even governmental entities have archives that can be of assistance. The New York State Archives are helping me right now to identify the very first steam vessel that ever carried a calliope. And there are times, sad to say, where you have to bite the bullet and make travel plans for viewing materials at one of these institutions, especially if they have special collections or antiquarian holdings and feel like charging you $300 for a digital reproduction, which is an actual fee I've encountered, which I do not have. But in general, the people working at these places are glad to help you with your research. It is their job, after all. Now, I've had wonderful experiences working with the professionals at places like the Mercantile Library in St. Louis. We were actually just there. The Howard Tilton Memorial Library at Tulane, the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library, and even the Parkinson Research Library. If you haven't heard of that, that's because it's at the Circus World Museum in Baraboo, Wisconsin, which I have to tell a quick anecdote about this. This is one of my favorite stories from the research. Dad and I were there 2008, 2009, one of those years. We were going through all their file boxes of all their calliope stuff, and they ended up having just a huge amount of useful materials, which to me was actually unexpected. I was very fortunate we decided to go there. One of the days that we were there, as we were coming back from lunch, we noticed that the skies overhead had started to darken and perhaps take on a foreboding tinge of green. We hadn't so much as parked in the parking lot when the tornado sirens began to sound. So we rushed up the stairs into the library where the archivist, Erin Foley, told us to follow her. She led us behind her desk and to a stairwell which led down into the basement of the library. She opened this heavy door at the bottom and flipped on the fluorescent lights, and they sprang to life, illuminating an absolutely cavernous vault that seemed to go on for miles. There were shelves and shelves and shelves of circus artifacts, the stuff just on the floor, lying around as far as the eye could see. I think we kind of forgot about the menacing weather outside and just enjoyed the feast for the eyes. It was really incredible. Now, I'm not a circus person. I don't know anything about it really, but it was very, very cool. Anyway, back to where to find research materials. There are other subscription services you can use to find things like academic journals, doctoral theses and dissertations, but many of those are only accessible, for example, through your local library or an institution of higher learning. In my experience, although again, the staff are happy to help members of the community to access those resources, even if you don't have a direct connection to the institution. And finally, you might actually be surprised to learn just how much you can find with a simple Google search. Now, by no means does it come with any assurance of being a comprehensive or even mildly productive pursuit, but sometimes if you come up with creative search terms or just slog through all the results, you're rewarded with these hidden gems that you might not have found through another venue. For example, I have frequently found PDF versions of two important entertainment industry magazines, Billboard and Bandwagon, along with a handful even of relevant Waterways Journal issues, just by searching through Google. It's a decent next step if you feel stuck in a certain area of your research, but one that you definitely have to be judicious about the quality of the venue that's giving you the information. So, okay, I've saved the big one for last. Let's talk about newspapers. Probably a familiar front page to some of us. This is an insanely complicated topic to get into, but here goes. So let's start off with just what is available out there. Newspapers, of course, have long been the target of digitization efforts because of just the wealth of information they contain. They're a contemporary record of the state of everything, from the international on down to the hyper-local. There's little of consequence that isn't captured in at least one publication, and oftentimes things that are truly of no consequence to anyone, but that's neither here nor there. Vast swaths of the newspaper industry have been digitized and made available to the public, and more delightfully, can be searched by date, by location, and crucially by keyword or phrase. This is all possible through a technology called optical character recognition, which has been around for decades, but it's gotten really good in the last 10 years or so. OCR for short, I should say. It works by scanning or otherwise capturing an image of a page of some source material, and then you use specialized software to recognize the individual characters, the letters or numbers or punctuation, which are present in the image, and then you output that as digital text. The software does this all for you. The beauty of it is that the digital text can then be treated like any other text is on a computer. So you could store it in a database, for example, to be queried by search terms. And that's where the great advantage of OCR technology is for researchers. You can search for practically anything you want. And as long as the OCR process was of sufficient quality, you're going to get useful results. Now, OCR certainly works best with typeset material, which fortunately newspapers are. The results obtained through OCR are reliant upon not only the visual quality of the source material being scanned, but also the quality of the scanning method. For example, you might encounter a page of newspaper that's been torn or folded because it's old, or maybe the scan was out of focus. You also have to contend with the unusual font and typesetting choices made by the newspaper printers, not to mention spelling mistakes and other typos. I can't begin to count the number of variations of the word calliope I've searched for over the years. Spelled correctly, spelled with one L, spelled with a K instead of a C, spelled with a Y on the end, any combination of these. And to be really comprehensive in your searching, if you want to be, I, for example, anytime I use the word calliope in conjunction with another keyword, say searching for the phrase steam calliope, or a Boolean query like calliope and excursion boat, you can see just how many individual searches you have to do to get all the possible spellings of calliope in there. Now, that's not even to mention colloquialisms like steam organ or steam piano. Multiply that by all the keywords you might search for in addition to that, and take the nickel company from Cincinnati as an example. Anytime I want to find a mention of that firm, I have to search for T.J. Nickel and Thomas J. Nickel and Thomas Nickel without the middle initial, and Thomas abbreviated T-H-O-S with and without the J plus nickel. You truly have to get creative with your search terms if you want to really be thorough. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining. It sounds like I'm complaining. I'm not complaining. I am thrilled that not only are searches through newspapers so easily possible, but that there are so many places to find them online. In many cases, gone are the days where you'd have to physically search through microfilm reels on site, or, God help you, actual paper copies. So much of it can be found through publicly available websites. The big one out there is newspapers.com. Not surprisingly, owned by Ancestry.com. I swear I don't work for them. I am not a corporate shill for Ancestry. Their coverage is constantly expanding with the addition of new local papers, and you can even set up a recurring alert based on search terms that gets emailed to you every month, which is super helpful if you've already gone through 100,000 pages of something. Another major compilation of searchable newspapers is newspaperarchive.com, which has a lot of papers that are not available on newspapers.com. Both of these, like Ancestry, are sites that require a paid subscription, but again, to a researcher like me, they're without a doubt worth that cost. And then there's, of course, additional newspaper websites that are more limited in scope. One of the great ones is the Illinois State Historical Newspapers Project. And a lot of papers that are still being published today have their own archives. That's actually the situation for my own hometown paper, the Dubuque Telegraph-Herald. Their archive was only recently placed online, and fortunately all you need is a library card from our local library to be able to access it, which is great. Okay, you've got the access, you know what you want to search for, what's next? Well, in river history, you have to be prepared for things to not be as straightforward as you want them to be. This I have found to be true in a number of ways. In short, not everything, especially the farther back in time you go, is going to have the journalistic integrity of the Associated Press. So a lot of this is thanks to the local river editors. Some were notoriously biased, with a not always reliable slant on reporting a fact. Over and over, you find blurbs of ostensible news that contain blatant advertising written by the steamboat companies or their captains, which can be confirmed when the same thing shows up verbatim on another day's issue, or even in another paper published in the next river town over, word for word. Then there are, again, all these colloquialisms that river editors use that their contemporaries probably understood, but are utterly impenetrable to the modern reader. The worst of these that I have found was the river columnist of the Evansville Journal, who would quote his field correspondent, Captain Ben F. Egan, saying things like, "The J.P. Doulord, one of Rymingthos's canoodlements, will soon quit scaping." Anybody here know what that means? All right, so let's break this down. We'll soon quit scaping. We're probably talking about a boat that's being taken out of service. J.P. Doulord, well, maybe you can suss out that this is referring to the apparent roustabout pronunciation of the Cumberland packet J.P. Druard. And then maybe you can unscramble Rymingthos as the owner of said boat, Captain Thomas G. Ryman. Isn't that fun? Another thing that you quickly become aware of is just how much repetition there was between papers. River editors would repeat copy from river columns in other papers, sometimes paraphrase, but often word for word. For someone like me, it makes source corroboration a bit frustrating when you realize a news item is just being parroted for a different local audience rather than actual independent reporting. But if you're armed with the knowledge that these things happen, and they occur frequently in newspapers, you can start to get a feel for sorting out facts from otherwise. You learn what to rely on as relatively dependable info and what to take with a grain of salt. And you come to really savor the intriguing passages when they jump off the page. It was in the course of searching through countless newspaper pages that I began to collect these steamboat stories that weren't directly related to my Calliope research. And eventually, as I'm sure you're aware, that turned into something else altogether. River Intelligence came about because I just kept finding these fascinating stories and heretofore unknown facts, often told by the newspaper's river editor with a certain tongue-in-cheek flair. Eventually, I had this long list of topics that I think kind of overwhelmed Dad here, things that I could write on as articles for the Reflector. But it was probably going to look a little suspicious if the editor's son kept showing up as a featured author issue to issue. So instead, let's just make it a regular gig, keep it to a couple pages max, throw it in the back of the magazine, and that works for me. I will say, the nice part about having a column is that I only have to write 2 pages every 3 months. And I can usually take up space with a number of pictures, so that's helpful. Now, as if to drive the point home about unexpectedly coming across something interesting, let me tell you about just earlier this week. After that wonderful weekend at the Howard Museum, hearing Philip Johnson and Captain Mike Williams give a really great update on the past and current status of our beloved Delta Queen, Dad and I had a few days to kill before heading here to Marietta for the S&D weekend. We went back and forth on what we should do with the 3 extra days, and in the end, Dad graciously offered to tag along while we backtracked to St. Louis so that I could do a little Calliope research at the Mercantile Library there. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of visiting there, the Herman Teapot National Inland Waterways Library, housed at the Mercantile, includes, among other collections, the full run of the Waterways Journal going almost all the way back to the beginning of the late 1880s, primarily on microfilm. Only certain ranges of years have been indexed, which is unfortunate, but that's where I'd have to get started. We made it up to the year 1915 when something caught Dad's eye that we'd like to show you. In that year's annual end-of-year issue that featured scores and scores of New Year's greetings from subscribers, we happened upon this greeting from a 14-year-old Fredway Jr. It reads, "Enclosed, please find $2 to renew my subscription. Received your Christmas present this AM and want to thank you very much for same. Have just read that I have lost my long-held title, Youthful Subscriber. I hope our new Beaver, Pennsylvania friend will enjoy the journal as much as the rest of us do. Wishing you a Merry Christmas. I remain yours very truly, Frederick Way, Jr." Dad and I, we really got a kick out of that. Fred being referred to as a youthful subscriber, of course, this being nearly 50 years before starting the Reflector, and if you can believe it, more than 100 years removed from the present day. So that's probably a good segue into the next point I want to make about conducting this sort of research and writing about river history. Fred's holiday note is a fitting reminder that every story we tell, every boat we discuss, every historical fact that we search for is the result of the individuals involved and the relationships that they've forged. In a sense, the people we know and knew and the people they knew and are carried on through tradition are the social currency that we use to feel like part of a community. Just think about that hilarious story that you recount over and over, and maybe the names change, but it's the same story. Those things that you repeat every year with your river friends. I guarantee that the reason it's a cherished memory is because of the people who were involved. What you come to realize is that everything, and I mean everything, is about people. It's funny to say this to this group, but it's really not about the boats. In my Calliope research, it's actually not about a musical instrument. These are important venues, and they're important physical objects, and sometimes they're the things that stick around as a reminder after people are long gone. But the stories and what really matters are all about the people. People are what storytelling is all about. They're what imbue a story with color, and they're what keep us coming back for more. Hearing about them helps us understand our own heritage and our identity. People, it must be said, and rightfully so, are also why you can do research at all. Whether it's the people who came before you, who spent years collecting, or those who were the ones who were there and can give firsthand accounts, or any of the people who so generously give of their time in any of countless ways, it's not something that one does alone. It also helps tremendously to have a tireless and forgiving research assistant who happens to be related to you. The lesson for me is it takes a village. I am far from being the only person preserving this Calliope tradition or this riverboat tradition. I am so grateful to each of the individuals who have been there along this lengthy, winding road of research, a number of whom are in this room tonight, lending assistance and representing the unending hospitality that is the hallmark of the river community. That sounds like the end of my talk, but it's not. Now, you do not spend countless hours around other people with making a few blunders. Let's talk about those. Sometimes Sometimes you find that your dogged pursuit of the truth has unintentionally placed you in the middle of a blood feud, for example. Or you reach out to an individual and find out, guess what? They really didn't want to be reached out to. There's also, this is maybe another recurring theme, self-awareness, ironically, that you need to have, that not everybody is as fanatical about your interest as you are. Especially with the calliope, you either love it or hate it with no in-between. When we were visiting Captain Gabe Tschiggfrie at his home a few years ago, where he has the original steamer Idlewild / Avalon calliope on a trailer in his backyard, he told us how every time he plays it, which is only about twice a year, his neighbor will hear it and bring him a bottle of wine. But it's unclear whether that's a token of his appreciation or a bribe to let off the keys for the next 6 months. There are also, switching gears completely, the lost opportunities because you didn't pay proper respect to time. There's all the things that are lost to history with the passing of people before you even start your research, certainly. But it's the ones that you could have done something about that sting. People like Captain Hawley, for example. I had the chance to interview him several times in the last 15 years of this research, and certainly cherished the chances Dad and I had every time we were able to visit with him. But I still had questions for him that I never got around to asking. Same goes for Dave Moorcraft, who I met in 2008 and who welcomed my interest with a graciousness for which I will always be thankful. It was a little more than a year after I first met Dave. I don't know if you'd met him before we started, or I started the research. But only about a year after that, Dave even asked me to tag team with him playing the Calliope in the Great Circus Parade in Milwaukee, which was a huge honor for me. Zach, Dad and I often talk about this particular photo that we took because your dad challenged us to tell him which was the original nickel whistle and which one was a Moorcraft whistle. And neither one of us could do it. They're that good. And well, maybe if you kind of took it apart, the point being, they're both the real deal. They are the real, genuine article, and coincidentally now, so are yours.
It's the one on the left. The one on the left that says.
Okay, tell us how you know that. Mostly so I can take.
I got to look a little closer. Oh, I can tell the way it's machined at the Langwood.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. But to the rest of us mere mortals. See,
man, now I'm having trouble with it.
All the more proof that they are the real thing. I also wish that I had more time with Keith Norrington. Uncle Keith, as we called him. Who often wrote to me encouraging my research efforts and offering whatever he could to help. His was a lovely, giving soul, and we likewise miss him terribly. Another example is Captain Dennis Trone, who I only met in person once, around 2007. The following year, when I started my calliope research in earnest, I had just cold called him, asking if he had any information on the origin of the Julia Bell Swain's calliope. Shortly thereafter, he called back and left me a brief voicemail. It was a Friday, as I recall, so I was probably occupied in a college class at the time. But he explained that he didn't actually know much about it, other than he got it from a guy at the Circus Museum in Baraboo. Captain Trone said he'd call back to schedule a time to meet up in Galena or Dubuque to chat with me some more. So I saved the voicemail from my phone onto the computer and waited for another call instead of just actually following up myself. That day was May 2nd, 2008, and 3 days later, Denny was killed when his single-engine plane crashed while landing. It was a stark reminder that you can't take it for granted that who's here today will be here tomorrow. And so you make mistakes. It happens to all of us. You just have to accept that it's going to happen. But maybe that makes the victories all the more sweet. Victories like being able to identify and verify no more, or no more, no fewer than 228 boats in the United States since the invention of the steam calliope that have carried an instrument. 228. Did anybody think it was that many? Often accompanied by a good story or two. Victories like a list of over 130 calliope players in that same span of years, often with biographical details that the layman would find outrageously doubtful, but are in fact the truth, sometimes. Then there's also the satisfaction of having put together the fullest accounting to date of the three most consequential historical calliope manufacturers. All of this contributing to the clearest overall picture of the history of the steam calliope on the river. You also learn to savor the surprises, such as discovering that the sternwheel JS carried 2 calliopes for at least 3 seasons. Why on earth would that be? Were the Tschiggfries, famous for their acumen in the excursion business, comparing 2 manufacturers to see which one would bring in more passengers? Or maybe one was a steam model and the other was a newfangled compressed air model. That's how this goes. You're left with more questions than you started with, every time. Every now and then, your questions do get answered, simply and definitively. An old tape recording of Doc on the Avalon Calliope includes a couple of short numbers that none of the Calliope brain trust here could identify. So we finally asked him. For the first one, he said, "Oh, that's GAGA." We'd never heard of it. Doc said, "I made that one up," and called it that because those are the first 4 notes of the song. The second one on that tape, or maybe it's a different tape, I don't recall, but the second one, not only did Doc not recognize the song, he had no recollection of ever playing it. That's probably one of the songs I just invented on the spot and never played again. Well, there you go, question answered. But this is unfortunately the exception and not the rule. And then, of course, there are the revelatory finds that come out of the blue and just leave you breathless. See the September 2023 reflector for the full story of this one. The one thing that I will add to the story about these instruments is a little pet theory of mine that I can't completely verify, but I like this idea. The American Steam Music Company, Calliope, which you see in the, well, actually both pictures, this became the George Kratz family heirloom and was still owned by George and his brother William at the time that this photograph was taken of a fairly young Thomas J. Nickel on the right, standing next to George. Now, there are no details about this photo other than it was taken around 1892, which is just when Thomas was starting his steam fitting business in Cincinnati. We know that Nickel would start filling orders for steam calliopes the very next year. One could string together a story that perhaps Nickel came to Evansville to examine that Kratz family calliope, especially when you consider how similar the mechanism is between that old model from 1859 and Nickel's instruments, both of which are a significantly different design from the calliopes that George Kratz himself built. Could Nickel have gotten the basic design from that particular calliope in Evansville? A more cavalier historian might try to claim that's actually what took place, but I will stop short of declaring that to be a historical certainty. The mind, though, is full of such possibilities when you're doing this research and when you're constantly bombarded with these small pieces of info and evidence here and there that you start to put together like a jigsaw puzzle. But the confirmation of it always remains elusive. So anyhow, it has been a long grind, both my research and this talk, and it continues to be. Some research methods just have to be done the old-fashioned manual way. Over time, you do see the fruit of your labor. Even longer than studying calliopes, I've been keeping track of additional information related to the boats in Captain Way's Directories, as I mentioned before. Long ago, it got to the point that I had to abandon keeping notes by scribbling in the margins, and instead, I have a couple of lengthy spreadsheets now. All told, I have evidence for 220 additional Western River steam vessels that I'm aware of that aren't in the directories. But if you include a few other sources, including that magnificent 1811 to 1848 compilation by John White, that number skyrockets to over 2,100. And I've also put together corrected or supplementary information on, coincidentally, 2,100 of the existing packet and towboat entries, which works out to roughly 1 in every 4 of the boats in the directories. All right, so when you add it all up, it's all been worth it. It's a sort of satisfaction that I imagine Fred Way must have felt when he when he compiled the directories over all those years, developing a resource for future generations that he must have suspected would become indispensable for so many people. And it's that aspect of the Ways Directories that led to the idea for the Ways Directories digitization project, which will be the focus of the long-awaited second part of this presentation. While working on my various Calliope and River history projects, 3 things about the directories became clear, other than how magnificent they are, of course. First, they are, in a physical sense, unwieldy. They're big, they're heavy, and they're not exactly what you'd call portable. Even consolidated into that big binder, it's not something you want to be lugging around very much. Still, it's tough when you're stuck in a situation where you wish you had one of them on you. Second, while the index in the back of the books are very, very helpful, they are incomplete, as they really only cover the names of people and organizations. Searching for vessels by place, or by year, or by any other really essential historical data is a very time-consuming task. And if you want to do some kind of inquiry that has to do with aggregating data for all of the boats, it's simply prohibitive in terms of time and effort, unless you're just sitting around with nothing to do. So finally, as mentioned before, a wealth of additional information, including corrections, has come to light since the print directories were published. Keeping up with that supplementary information can be a chore and an uncertain one at that, when you have so many different competing sources. So it seemed obvious that the solution to all of these issues was to take the historical data that's found in the directories and populate an electronic database that could be queried by a researcher. This is, I think, the logical next step in keeping with what I noted earlier regarding the overwhelming difference that digitization and free online access has made to for historical researchers. As I started to recognize the benefits of such an undertaking, I also came to terms with the fact that I couldn't do it alone. One day I got talking with fellow steamboat buff Jason Plank from Peoria, who said he'd had the same idea recently. Together, we put together a plan and wrote up a proposal for the project, which was submitted in late 2022 to the trustees of the J. Mack Gamble Fund. I put together a short video presentation for them, and after their deliberation, the trustees agreed to fund our project, and I'm glad to say that Jason and I have made a lot of headway in the last 18 months. More details on that at the very end. So I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as I can. The rationale for the project includes what I've already mentioned, but the scope is actually quite a bit wider than that. The anticipated outcomes of the project are meant to serve S&D's mission statement, lighting up the past, present, and future of America's inland rivers. So, by digitizing the directories, we will reinvigorate public interest in the story of American steamboating. We will provide persistent free access to historical data that may be difficult to find or even impossible to find for certain populations. We will enable the recognition of historical trends and the construction of historical narratives through data aggregation. And we will promote the historical and educational purposes of the sons and daughters of pioneer rivermen. Now, how are we going to achieve those goals? Well, it's a solution with multiple parts, but here are the basics. So, first, we have to create a database. This database is structured to most accurately and logically represent the type of data that you find in the print directories. Vessel details, info about operators and owners, places, individuals, all of this. Then comes everyone's favorite phase, data entry, where we populate that database with all the actual historical facts. This is the time-consuming part, and it's super fun. All this happens, by the way, behind the scenes before we have anything public-facing. Second part that we have to do, we build a web portal or a website that anyone can access, which pulls the requested information from that database and displays it in an easy-to-read format. This is the actual website that people will see on their computer screens. Finally, we need something between the two. In order to talk to the database, There's this interface layer, which frankly, I don't understand how it works. That's Jason's field entirely. But it translates what a user requests on the website into language that the database can understand, and then sends the returned data back to the website to be displayed. This is also all under the hood. The public will never see this part of it. What really matters is the design of that website, because we want people to find it actually useful. So, because the web portal is the means by which the public will access the database, its design has to be really deliberate. There's a whole host of attributes to websites that make them discoverable, easy to use, and in the end, useful. And we intend to speak to each of those. So if we do our job, then we can expect different types of users coming to the website to see these outcomes. The general public will be able to reliably, easily, and with no cost access and offer contributions to steamboating history. Historians and researchers will be able to gain a more complete view of the role of the steamboat in Western waters. S&D will be able, we hope, to see a measure of increased membership due to heightened public awareness. And Ohio University Press, which is the publisher of both of the directories, will be able to see a resurgence of interest in the directories due to heightened public awareness. So here comes the part you actually want to know about this project, though. How's it going to work? So I really wish I could show you the website, but we haven't built it yet. We have a demo version set up that actually we used to talk to the trustees about visualizing the end goal of the project. But that's not likely what the actual website is going to specifically look like, so I don't want to give you a false first impression of it. Instead, what I'd like to do is take you through the types of things that the website would be able to do for you once we have it deployed to the public. So you could do things like search through vessel records with all kinds of criteria. You can look it up by the weight number or the name of the boat, both whole or in part, including if the boat was renamed. You can look up the rig and the class of the boat, all the hull info, where it was completed, the rated tonnage, the machinery type, paddle info, boiler info, deck equipment, the final disposition, what ended up happening to the boat, all the organizations and individuals that are associated with the boat, and then, of course, information on particular, for example, packet trades or routes. And then in addition to the boat information, you'll be able to also search through all the people and all the organizations, all the different locations, and even by a specific date or event. So what kinds of questions could you answer then if you come to this website and start searching? Well, you could answer things like, what year did the Verney Swain become rechristened for the third time? Because that boat had 4 different names. What boats had unusual engine configurations? There were some sternwheelers that had 4 engines. Did you know that? I didn't know that. Who was involved with the Combine's river operations? Who was on watch when the Sprague rammed and sank Eisenbarth and Henderson's floating palace? What steamboat companies were affected by the ice gorge breakup in 1913? You could find all that on this website by searching for those things. But I think what's really exciting are the types of things you could answer thanks to the ability of computers to aggregate data together, which is to say, take all these disparate pieces of information and tell a single story from them. So things like, what was the average beam of a wooden hull? Could you imagine trying to do that just flipping through the print directories? What proportion of Howard-built boats were side-wheelers versus stern-wheelers? Or center-wheelers? How many boats ran all the way to Fort Benton on the Missouri, and when did that happen? What was the busiest packet trade? Statistically, was it actually bad luck to name a boat with the letter M? The last thing that we want to be sure to add as a feature to this website is making sure that the results that are returned from the search are very easy to understand. So we have to be really careful about how we design the display of the information. All of the information that's available for a given result needs to be displayed in a very legible format. We want you to be able to compare information when there are multiple results that match your search terms. And critically, every time we return a result, we want to give the page reference in the print directories and encourage people, this is just the raw data. Go read the directories to hear the stories. We also want to make sure that for populations, for example, with visual impairment, we want them to be able to see the website well and be able to get the information they need. So the website, finally, will also include a function for users to send us feedback, not only just about how the website works, but if they have additional information beyond what's in the directories, we want a mechanism for them to be able to send that to us and we can add it in. So I'm sure this all sounds really impressive, but as I know firsthand from over a decade of project management experience, you gotta have a plan or ain't nothing getting done. So here's the overview we presented in our proposal to the J. Mack Campbell Fund. I'm not gonna go over this point by point because that's ridiculous, but essentially we broke it down into 4 quarters and had milestones for each quarter of what we would achieve to finally get this out in the public. So that was the plan. That was the plan. Then real life happened. I have taken on new responsibilities at home and at my church, and sad to say, just in the last 6 weeks, I've been contending with an unexpected layoff, which is not fun. And Jason had something in the last few months come up to, oh yeah, he had a newborn son. Yeah, that'll do it. So add to this that not only did the design of the database turn out to require a much more complex structure than we initially anticipated, we have also discovered discrepancies and even contradictions in the data in the directories themselves, and we have to sort that out before we can proceed. So in order for the search features to work correctly, we have to set up multiple layers of hierarchy in the data so that the website understands the relationships between all those different types of data. Long story short, Jason and I have had to revise our plans significantly. We intend to complete the project as defined in the proposal. There's no change in that respect. And of course, we're not asking for any additional funding. But the timeline has had to change because of this. So here's what we have accomplished to date. And this represents a little over 600 hours of combined effort between me and Jason. We have figured out where this is going to be hosted. Thank you, CR, for offering to host this eventually when we get it out there in public. We have designed and created the informational database structure. That is completely done, so we have been doing the data entry. And actually, we have added over 8,000 people already. And out of the 8,700 or so vessels that are in the 2 directories, we've added over 6,000 of those. So we're doing pretty good on the data entry portion of this. We've created controls to actually speed up our remaining data entry because in addition to those 2 things, we have all the locations and date things we need to put in. And then we do have a feature backlog for the actual website, and we have issue tracking set up for as we test it. So what remains is, obviously, to complete the data entry, we have to prioritize that backlog of features so we know what to implement first and second and third. We need to design and implement that website, which actually Jason's already started on, just told me this week. We have to stress test all the web components, and what that means is if you search for something, it can't take 5 minutes for the results to show up. So we need it to perform well. And then finally, obviously, we need to publish it so that the public can use it. So all of that considered, we believe it's going to take about another year to get this out in public. So hopefully, by the time we come back here next year, we will be able to actually demo the real thing for you. So the costs, just to answer the next question, what did we ask for in terms of funds? So all the stuff about creating the database, designing and developing everything, all that's being accomplished without funds. That is our capabilities that Jason and I already have by virtue of our day jobs. And again, CR has offered to cover the hosting on his account, so there's no recurring fee in addition to what already exists for having this online. So the financial support that we asked for and received from the Mack Campbell Fund covers the remaining data entry, and if we need to contract with a professional in website design, that's what we will use that money for. The funding approved for that was a little over $7,000, and we also have not yet determined what the actual web address or URL will be for this, but it should be something fairly simple. So we're not expecting any further costs in terms of domain either. So the last note that I want to be sure to cover with you, because I'm sure you've already thought of this, regarding the reproduction of historical data, Jason and I, of course, are sensitive to how people might feel about our publicizing this project, given the years of work that Captain Waste directories represent. And laws protecting copyright exist for a very good reason. They protect the intellectual property of creative individuals, and they help to ensure the profitability of enterprises. Still, it's important to make a distinction between historical fact on the one hand and what is referred to in copyright law as the art of a creative work. When the public has the right to discover the facts of something freely, the art of work, which is, by definition, the aspect which qualifies the work as a unique creative endeavor, that is protected by law. The art of Captain Way's storytelling and the particular phrasing he's used has been affixed in a tangible form in the print directories. We cannot lawfully reproduce word for word what's in the directories without permission from the publisher. So, for that reason, as I've already said, what we are reproducing on this database and on this website is just the historical data, not literally what's in the pages of the directories. Only the matters of fact that the public has a right to access are going to be shown on this website. We will refer back to the pages in the directory where the information came from. Our intent is to create a public resource that aids in the dissemination of Fred Wade's work, but leaves the storytelling to the print directories and encourages the public to purchase them. Okay, you made it. Last slide, I promise. Sort of. Remember earlier when I mentioned those lists of additions and corrections to the directories and how it's so difficult to keep up with all the new info that we know about? Well, why not just add it to this online database? After the initial website's released, we can begin a phase where we supplement the historical data, all that information that we've been collecting over years and years. Within each vessel entry that says labor or person or whatever, we can mark where this newer corrected information is, right alongside the original data. All of it would be seamlessly integrated. And that, I think, illustrates the great potential of digitization, the ability to keep up to date with the best information that's available. This is a dynamic medium, not a static one, like a print resource. And who knows where we could go from there. We can make this the definitive tool for river historians and steamboat fans alike for years to come. So, to wrap up, even the things you do essentially as a hobby can turn out to be substantial, both in terms of the portion of your life that they take up and possibly in the outcomes that they produce. It's kind of wild to me to think back and realize that all of this for me got started because as far back as I can remember, I watched and heard the spectacle of the Calliope of steamboats, thanks to another kid from Dubuque, who similarly was beguiled by the charms of these boats and the people who have walked their storied decks. We might not be pioneer rivermen ourselves, but like all of us here, we are a living testament to the call of the river, and we intend to preserve our shared heritage for future generations. Thank you all for your kind attention.